Or should I say?
am still here.
Should I say, right, mush? As Kyle MacLachlan likes to say to me.
You're right, Cobber.
You're right, mush. Me, mate.
I'm sure he's being compelled to adopt more current slang by his coterie of tiny enraged analysts.
That's right, because I think Kyle's he's older than me. I think he's closer to your age.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
So he's just surrounded by these essentially teenaged, angry online analysts.
Yeah. I like to imagine them them kind of circling around him in a protective ring, and they're all on scooters and vaping.
Why are they on scooters?
Well, that's what the young people do.
Is it?
It'd be some kind of crowdsourced, some kind of Uber scooter thing.
We've got those.
Yeah, there we go.
And
I'm presuming the real American cities have them, not
Cincinnati. Even a pretend city like Cincinnati has it. And in classic old man fashion, I can tell I'm aging because I hate them and I'm not really sure why. Excellent. But every time I see one, I just have a nameless irritation. God,
it's the young.
These youngs and their scooters.
Oh, sweet. I just saw on Twitter, Megan Anderson. I give Amanda Nunes a lot of problems she's never seen before.
Okay, all right. Welcome, everyone, to a new edition of Heavy Hands. Phil McKenzie and I have just spent an hour and a half discussing exactly what you would expect. It was all fight talk, wasn't it, Phil?
Yes.
It wasn't about
100%.
It wasn't about comic book movies or how much I hate Rogue One or anything except the incredible fight which happened last weekend, and which I promise you we still have the interest and the energy necessary to discuss in depth. I'm talking, of course, about Robert Whittaker versus Israel Adesanya. Phil and I fucked up our pick. What's new? Israel Adesanya is now the undisputed middleweight champ. I will be very, very eager to point out that even though Zane Simon correctly predicted the main event, he had a terrible pick in the co-main, which both Phil and I got right. And that is, in fact, the more important fight to get correct. Dan Hooker versus Ally Quinta. We're going to talk about that as well. And coming up next weekend, we have what I think we both agree, Phil, is a pretty solid fight night card.
It doesn't look that great when you start looking down it, because in part because I think we've been trained by modern fight night cards to expect there to be a steady decline in quality as the card gets further down. But it is one of the weird cards where you could debatably say that the preliminaries are actually better than the main card.
Less name value certainly, but some good matchups, many of them actually relevant, most of them pretty exciting looking. It's just a little weirdly structured, but shit, we've got Chito Vera versus Andre Ewell, quite cruelly, I might add, opening the card, the very first prelim. And the prelims end with Nico Price versus James Vick. I think we'll get a chance to discuss both of those fights, both very interesting. And of course, in the main event, Joanna Jedrzejczyk versus Michelle Waterson, in a matchup that I think may have sort of sneakily become more difficult for the former champion than it probably ever would have been before. So we will look forward to talking about that. But first, let's mourn the death of Bobby Knuckles, who will surely never return to form, this being the middleweight division. And as you were very optimistically predicting, Phil, he's probably going to come back in 18 months after a series of grueling injuries and rehabilitations and get knocked out by Edmund Shabazian.
It's the only possible future for him now.
Yeah, that's... Welcome to hell, folks. Well, okay, let's talk about the fight, right? We both thought Robert Whittaker would win. He didn't. I think the interesting question to lead off on, because a lot of people are discussing Whittaker's approach, how soundly he got out-countered by Adesanya, at least at the two key moments that decided the fight. I think the interesting question to ask is, do you think this was an uncharacteristic performance from Robert Whittaker?
I don't tend to think so. I kind of think he just got outfought. I mean, I think that there are certainly like tactical adjustments that he could have made that would have made this fight better and that he could make going into a rematch. But as we discussed like before we started recording the show, this fight in itself was a strange sorcerer's apprentice kind of monkey's paw of fight analysis for us, because we discussed that both fights are probably better on the front foot. Robert Whittaker would be better served to pressure and go for volume.
Monkey's paw, sorcerer's apprentice. I'm an American, Phil. What are these things?
Oh, God damn it. I need to think of... Is there an episode of the Power Rangers where that happened? Shit.
Is there like a Family Guy episode or something you can reference?
Have you seen that Fantasia thing with Mickey Mouse?
I genuinely, unironically love Fantasia. It's probably my favorite movie as a kid.
Okay, that thing.
The dinosaurs. Yeah, okay. So it's like dinosaurs. Please go on. Sorry to interrupt.
But yeah, so... we said that he had to take the pace, he had to pressure,
yep,
and he did that.
Yeah.
And we mentioned, as many others did, that Adesanya struggled with the blitzes and the approach of Kelvin Gastelum, and Whittaker blitzed and came in, and we mentioned that Adesanya wasn't much of a same time counterpuncher, and so Whittaker would be able to kind of approach in those moments where he's at risk. Without the risk he would against someone who likes to counter in that way.
Mm-hmm.
So this was all sort of... We saw Robert Whittaker doing the right things in the broad strategic sense, and it got him knocked the fuck out.
Yeah. That was my immediate feeling too, was after this, after the fight, I was thinking about it. And I thought... I thought much more firmly at the time that it was an uncharacteristically aggressive, an uncharacteristically reckless showing from Robert Whittaker. You've helped me to cast some doubt on that idea, and we will talk more about how we may have learned some things about why Adesanya was a tricky style matchup for him. But even thinking like, oh man, he was way too crazy, he was way too aggressive, I was still constantly reminding myself, that's kind of what I thought he had to do. Like, I could make some adjustments to how he did it, but I can't really fault him and his team for thinking that we have to keep Adesanya on the back foot. We got to have the first word and the last word. We got to win the exchanges and prevent him from building momentum, taking the initiative. Especially, we have to prevent him from getting off freely with his kicks and pushing us backwards. And those were all things in the broad sense that I would have personally advised before the fight. So yeah, it's kind of hard to question the broad intent of Whittaker's showing. So the other question is like, why don't you think it was uncharacteristic? What about this fits into your model of like who Robert Whittaker is as a fighter? And why did it just end up looking different here? Or like, is there a comparison where you think Whittaker went through a similar experience and was similarly threatened or solved for it?
I mean, I think the biggest example is probably the Wonderboy Thompson fight.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, like looking back on that, because I went back and looked at it, after the Adesanya fight, it looks like actually I remember it as being kind of a wild fight where Whittaker just went after him and got finished. But it was actually a much more controlled performance in many ways.
Than this one, you think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think partially it might be because, I believe Whittaker was actually training with Zahabi and TriStar at that point.
Mm.
It was much more like lead hand dominant performance, whereas in this one it seemed like Whittaker was heavily leaning on the right hand. But I think it did tell us something, which is that Whittaker does not really like to chase people. Or at least when he does, he really tries to get in on them.
He'd like to be hitting them while he's chasing them.
Yeah, because I think he is, and this is always a question you have to ask, is that he is a subtle fighter, but the question is always, what can you do to slough the subtlety of a fighter away? And I think for Robert Whittaker, I think what he really likes is to be touching his opponents.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the second Yoel Romero fight is a tremendously diverse performance from him. It's one where he, plays off the left hand a lot. He sets up his kicks very well. He's, it is a much more, it's an infinitely more controlled looking performance than this fight.
Mm-hmm.
Even when it started going wrong. And
like, very notably,
Romero's,
he was much more satisfied with landing just his jab for much longer stretches in that fight, which probably could have helped here because he was having more success with his jab than he was anything else.
But the difference between that fight and this one is that he was connecting in that fight, and not necessarily he wasn't connecting clean shots, but it was that Romero was picking them off with his elbows, his arms,
right.
Whittaker was always able to set something up on him.
Mm-hmm.
I think when he came forward and he was hitting air, even occasionally, it was just making him automatically feel like he had to step in further. And I think that was exacerbated by the way that he was just about landing on Adesanya.
Mm-hmm.
That he was landing the up jab as he stepped in. And the Adesanya was leaning way back out, and that he must have just kept thinking, "I am within inches of landing the perfect shot on this guy,"
which he was over and over.
Yeah, but he was those same inches away every time.
Yeah,
and Adesanya had clearly, and we've got to give a tremendous amount of credit to Adesanya here, because this was yet another performance in which he's just stepped up again and looked. At every point, he's been given a matchup which seems particularly tough, and at every point, he has shown himself to be better.
Yeah,
and this was another one of those. He basically he either corralled Whittaker into kind of running past him as Whittaker tried to set up the right hook and just hit him with the check left hand, or he swayed over to the right and hid behind his own shoulder and just had the right hand go past him.
Mm-hmm.
And Whittaker, he stripped away the Whittaker's oblique kicks that he used against Romero pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Very quickly solved those, which I will say, just as a bit of a teaser, maybe that's interesting for a possible Adesanya-Jones fight down the line. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Being really easily able to deal with linear kicks at range. That's something.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. If we get the John Jones who still doesn't, who still thinks he's a great kickboxer,
and who has
kind of Israel Adesanya,
forgotten how to set up his takedowns at this point, and that's interesting.
Yeah, but
I just want to kind of double back just before we move on and say, I think in the lead up to this, a lot of people came, in comments and Twitter replies and things, were asking, who's the better defensive fighter? And I don't know that I still wouldn't say that, in terms of fundamentally sound defense, in terms of, being ready with defensive moves and having the ability to, chain them together cleanly, that Robert Whittaker is maybe not still the better defensive fighter than Israel Adesanya. I think that maybe distracted me, possibly us, I don't know how you feel about it, from a better question, which was, is Israel Adesanya the best defensive fighter Robert Whittaker's ever faced? Or is he at least comparable to someone like Stephen Thompson, who knocked Robert Whittaker out? And I think the answer to that is a resounding yes. And that was more important here, I think, because I tend to agree with you pretty firmly that one thing that made Whittaker look so much more reckless and made him more willing to reach and lunge even than we've seen, for a guy who's kind of known for it, even more than we've seen from him in quite some time, I think, was the fact that he just was not able to connect cleanly as often as he would have liked, and was not able to build off of the jabs, which are the only things that he was really landing cleanly for most of the fight. So I do think that probably had a psychological effect on him. And I think if you look back at his previous performances, you'd probably find, with very few exceptions, that the people that Whittaker like styles on, even if he gets a round where he's just styling on his opponent, he's just consistently able to touch them. They're not very evasive fighters in the same way that Adesanya can be, even if the technique behind his evasion is less than perfect in a lot of ways. He's more committed to it. He uses his eyes to protect himself and stay away from clean hits. And I think that frustrated Whittaker, or at the very least goaded him into being even more aggressive as the fight carried on.
Yes. And, so I think there was one of the specific things that, we didn't see from Whittaker that, again, I think we probably should have picked up on, is we didn't see much in the way of bodywork from him, because he's never been a prolific body puncher. And I think this is in some ways, part of the whole, this is in some ways part of the whole sort of karate boxer style. It tends to sort of prioritize headhunting, at least in the fighters that we see from it. But, that's also an MMA thing typically.
Yeah.
And, we've mentioned multiple times that if someone is leaning away from your shots the whole time, their body is typically wide open. And
body and legs. It's the Machida Shogun conundrum. Like, you don't have to hit them in the head. If their head is always leaning away, you are guaranteed the opportunity to hit them elsewhere, in fact.
Yeah, and I think that also keying in on the head left Whittaker extending exchanges when he didn't realize how out of position he was.
Yeah.
Because he was seeing Adesanya like leaning back over his feet, and thinking, this guy's ripe for an Anderson Silva, Chris Weidman style knockout. But Whittaker was not realizing that he was often, like, his own feet were badly out of position by this point. Mm-hmm. And he was still just kind of swinging, thinking that Adesanya was the one who was positionally checkmated. But Adesanya, as we said, like, his ability to keep his eyes and his ability to keep his base, like that last finishing sequence is that
who's ever been more firmly rooted while doing the limbo? Who else is making those same little adjustment steps to transfer weight and stay in a good stance while your upper body has forgotten that a stance ever existed? That's a good sequence to look at if you want to talk about like the foot position here. It's something I think we probably should have hit on more in the preparation. It's certainly something we talked about earlier in Adesanya's UFC career, is how good he is at taking those small steps. That, I don't think most Robert Whittaker opponents have really been able to do. Yoel Romero does not have bad footwork. But a lot of the time you force him to move, it's a big movement. Jacare Souza does not have terrible footwork either, but you force him to move, it's going to be like these big, loping, committed movements. Israel Adesanya is making small adjustments in the midst of an exchange with his feet. And in the last sequence, you can see that Whittaker throws himself so off balance. I mean, again, this is something I can understand. In that sequence, he hits Adesanya with a sickeningly clean jab. Like, a horrifically, it's a Jack Dempsey jolt more than it is a jab. It's such a power lead left. Snaps Adesanya's head back, but Adesanya's feet are still rooted. He stays leaned back and starts swinging. Immediately after he takes the jab, too, he gets his eyes back on Whittaker, so he's not just swinging blind. He is targeting his shots. And Whittaker's out of position from that right hand, and then the first counter from Adesanya just makes it even worse. He gets totally squared up, and so like the last shot that lands ends up spearing him right down the center. It basically, if human bodies were tripods, we'd be a lot harder to knock down in a fight. So you have to like compensate for that by adjusting. You want to always have one foot firmly planted opposing the direction of the shot that's hitting you. That's how you maintain your balance. It's how the shock of the punch dissipates more effectively and you're able to withstand it. And if you get hit square so that, you know, the force of the shot is coming right at the center of your back, you know, or out the center of your ass and not leading down a leg into the ground, you're going down. And that happened to Whittaker both times that he got knocked down. He was way out of position with his feet. And Adesanya, despite leaning and limboing like a maniac, was in significantly better foot position both times.
Yeah. I mean, so I think Adesanya did a great job, as I think you mentioned, of preparing specific counters for Whittaker's entries. Because we mentioned, you know, he's not the same time counter guy, but his tendency to to drift off in one direction and be ready to come back, you know, it was typically with the left hook. He's often been like a right hand counter guy, but you could really see his left hook getting a lot of play in this fight.
He landed it consistently as a same-time counter. I think, like, you have to laud his preparation. It was something that he prepared to do, was to hit Whittaker while he was lunging in. And a lot of these exchanges, he did interrupt Whittaker as he was trying to close the distance. I think it really threw off his timing.
I did find myself wondering, are Adesanya's defenses slightly one-sided? Like, is there a common factor to, like, the guys that have troubled him have been southpaws? Because so I was wondering, is his tendency to kind of lean back into the right, is that something he was specifically doing to counter Whittaker's right hand? Or is that something he does? Or does he have ticks in his defense?
I think he does.
I suspect it might just be like, you know, Calvin Gastelum outperformed Whittaker not because he's a particularly craftier striker or anything, or even because he's tougher, but it might just be because he's a southpaw.
Whittaker also, one of the best shots of the fight that he landed, left high kick. Not the right high kick we usually see, left high kick. So there's something there. Yeah, Gastelum hit him with a left high kick and left straight. Those were the big shots. Marvin Vettori had considerable success with his left straight in the later portions of their fight once he realized that Adesanya wasn't, like, hurting him that badly, and just decided to start throwing anytime he threw. I think there's something there. Of course, Derek Brunson flies in the face of that theory. You know, he somehow diffused the masterful, subtle striking of Derek Brunson, world's greatest southpaw puncher. But, you know, it's the exception that proves the rule.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, everyone gets lucky.
Everyone who beats Derek Brunson does. Yeah, so fascinating fight. What else did I want to say about this? There was one area where I do kind of quibble with the idea that this is like a typical Robert Whittaker. And the idea that him not being able to find the chin, he also didn't get like as many opportunities to collide with his opponents as he usually does and like shove them away, get his hands on them. I think that may also be a comfort thing for Whittaker, where he's able to touch his opponent even when he's not hitting them. A lot of his fights involve him crashing together with his opponent and shoving them back. And Adesanya just didn't give him those opportunities. When he was doing same-time counters, he wasn't trying to meet momentum with momentum. He was angling and throwing. It was often the check hook. And otherwise, he was just skating backwards and moving as quickly as he could away from the attack. So Whittaker did not get many opportunities to land cleanly as he normally would have. He didn't get the opportunity to lay hands on his opponent with either punches or like hand fighting techniques, or even just, you know, brute shoving that he often does after he landed those jabs. But the other thing is that Whittaker is, I think, I'm willing to admit that stuff may be a factor in why he didn't perform this way in this fight, but he is typically a better body puncher. He's also typically a much better leg kicker. And yeah, like that stood out to me. He had success with one right low kick. You know, you mentioned before, Adesanya very quickly solved the sort of stomp kicks, the side kicks to the leg, the oblique kicks, however you want to call that sort of family of techniques. He solved that very quickly, which was impressive. But that's not like a fundamental Whittaker move. It's not like he spent his whole career developing around that move. It's not his jab, you know, like that's something he largely adapted after the first Romero fight. And before the first Romero fight, he would have, fights with, you know, strikers, people who wanted a ranged striking battle with him. and he always kicked them. He would always sell out on that right hand, and when it missed, like 30% of the time, he would decide to make it a right low kick instead, or he would tack that low kick onto the end because it worked so well with the mechanics of the 1-2 he likes to throw. And he didn't do that in this fight, which would have been great because Adesanya was frequently pivoting off to his left with that check hook. It would have been a very effective weapon. And Adesanya doing so much leaning back, just low kicks in general, as he's retreating, the legs are left behind. Those shots are there. Likewise, I do think we've seen more body punching from Whittaker than we saw in this fight. There were essentially no attempts whatsoever. Now, maybe that has to do with the fact that he's normally body punching on a more static opponent. You know, like we mentioned, the sort of stylistic differences between Romero and Adesanya, and I distinctly remember him jabbing Romero into a shell guard and then ripping his body with some hooks in their second fight. And
yeah, Adesanya did that to Whittaker rather than the other way around.
Right, yeah, exactly.
That was a lovely, I think, 4-punch combination he got Whittaker with by the fence.
Yeah. I think there were a couple instances of that, in fact, where Whittaker was forced to cover up and Adesanya instinctively immediately ripped to the body. But Whittaker didn't get those looks from Adesanya. He didn't get him covering up, and so maybe that was the trigger he was missing that would have otherwise got him to throw to the body. But to me, if you're fighting Adesanya, that might be a technique you want to have prepared ahead of time. Like, be aware of the fact he's going to be leaning back away from your headshots, and the body's there. Just hit his body with a hard straight right. Or a kick as he's retreating, something. Whittaker can do those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are definitely tactical adjustments he can make. More attritional work in general.
More feints.
Work behind feints more, yes. And take wins where he can get them. Yeah. As in, if you land a hard up jab, that's a hard up jab. It stands alone as its own like small win. You don't have to necessarily follow it up with something big. You can follow it up with a feint and then back him up into the fence. Or
the judges saw that. Be satisfied with it a little more than you were. Like the judges saw it. It snapped his head back. That's a win. That's you have now gained some momentum in the round. Yeah,
he can think about those adjustments that he would have made when he's waking up looking at a victorious Ian Heinisch in 2020.
You're a cruel, sick man, Phil McKenzie. But yeah, like at the end of the day, it was not. I don't think it was like an insensibly dumb performance from Robert Whittaker. I think he had a lot of the right ideas, and maybe just in the very specific details of execution could he have made adjustments. Certainly, I will say one other thing before we wrap up here. You had to have been aware, right, that like continuing to punch after the first layer of the exchange, that's not a good move against Adesanya specifically. Like we mentioned that. Like Adesanya looked to have prepared to counter Whittaker on the way in, which he did much better here than he has, certainly better than he did against Gastelum when he was blitzing forward. So that was great, but it's still not his A game. He's not going to like be the most comfortable or building off of that. It's when you keep throwing and you keep worsening your own position as Adesanya has taken that step back or has taken that angled step or whatever, or has leaned back. That's when you're in danger of him getting the space and seeing what's happening clearly enough to place a counter. So that struck me as a strategic error. That Whittaker was so willing to keep extending the exchanges. When, like, if you'd want to do that to Adesanya, Whittaker has the tools to do that successfully, but you would need to be ready with your defensive move. You would need to start the exchange, Adesanya pulls back, leans back, steps off to the side. Okay, now you might give him a feint to trigger the counter. Or the counter's already coming, you roll under it, and then continue the exchange, once he's thrown and is now even further out of position. You don't just keep punching. You literally did just trade with Adesanya each time that he managed to get him in the pocket. But I think he was frustrated by the fact that he didn't get him in the pocket nearly as often as he wanted. So, I get it. I just want to end up by saying, like, Israel Adesanya had a great performance. As much as you can critique and question what Whittaker did, like, Adesanya looked brilliant.
He's the man. I think it was Daniel Marty on Twitter. He said, less than 2 years ago, this man was getting wall installed by Rob Wilkinson.
By Rob Wilkinson. Yeah.
And now he's the middleweight champion of the world.
Yeah. And I think, as you said last week, I want to reemphasize, he's not been untested on his way up. It's been a short road along the lines of a Robert Whittaker at middleweight or a Conor McGregor. But if you had immense respect for what Whittaker was able to do, his resume, like the only thing he has that Adesanya doesn't, is just 2 fights with Romero, which is terrifying and impressive. But Adesanya's been, I think, pretty well tested. And it's hard to think of, other than Romero himself, who's the wrestler who's going to test the takedown defense that hasn't been properly tested yet? Or who's the striker that is going to be able to put the pressure on him? And, there are no glaring weaknesses that just haven't been prodded at yet, as far as I can see.
Presumably we'll get the answer to that fight next time when we get Borchinha, who is a diligent body puncher and incessant pressure threat, and has a notably huge left body kick.
Yes, and we did say last week, I think, that we suspected he'd be a tougher fight for Izzy than he would have been for Whittaker. Maybe we'll have to think on that further.
That might be true, and I will be rooting for Izzy hard in that one.
Oh, 100%. Yes. At the very least, he has a better fashion sense than Borchinha, who was wearing a legendarily terrible shirt at the event this last weekend. As I said on Twitter, this is what I do on the show now, Phil. I just repeat jokes I make on Twitter. It looked like he borrowed Max Holloway's wardrobe and didn't even bother to have anything retailored. He just squished himself into these tiny little featherweight shirts. So yes, go Israel Adesanya. Very sad for Bobby Knuckles, but it is hard not to just be impressed to hell by what Adesanya did. So that's the main event of UFC 243. There's probably lots more we could still discuss about it, but yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed it and had your hearts broken much as I think we did. After this, what do you say, Phil? Do you want to take a break, come back, and talk preview before we get into Hooker Iaquinta, or is Hooker Iaquinta simple enough that we can kind of just knock it down in about 5 minutes? That sounds about right, actually.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so after this, Iaquinta Hooker shouldn't take long. Pretty simple dynamic, played out more or less as we expected. And then we'll be moving on to next week's underappreciated card. Joanna Jedrzejczyk versus Michelle Waterson in the main event. Cub Swanson, Crone Gracie, Nico Price, James Vick, Chito Vera versus Andre Ewell. Plenty more that we could talk about besides after this. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. All right, welcome back to Heavy Hands, folks. As promised, we are moving on to the co-main event of UFC 243, Al Iaquinta versus Dan Hooker. It was, I just think, I don't know what compels me to do this, Phil, but I'm going to say it again. Al Iaquinta versus Donald Cerrone 2. And that's how it looked. It was a slightly slower, slightly more hittable Donald Cerrone, who pretty much had all the exact same successes. Started with some low kicks, just basically spent the whole fight playing off of the fact that Iaquinta is too slow-footed and too pathologically content to stay at his opponent's ideal range, largely because he's really, really susceptible to being jabbed in the face. And if you can mix up a low kick and a jab to the face and sort of play those off of each other even sort of well, then Iaquinta is going to have a much harder time getting to the range he needs, and that's what happened.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like I understand Dan Hooker now, or at least more than I used to. He's, as I mentioned before the fight, before this episode, he is Ben Rothwell.
And
he's exactly like Ben Rothwell.
As when you said it the first time, I feel like I understand Dan Hooker less now that you've made that comparison. Why do you say that?
Because he's one of these kind of handsy fighters who basically, he also like similar to like Rumble. I think he's one of these guys who basically has a relatively square stance and who wants you to come inside like his punching range, and he won't necessarily like wind up on his shots a lot. Mm-hmm. He'll just throw them from having his hands out, and it allows him to throw without losing his base. It allows him to throw without overcommitting, and I think this is more than the actual, because this is where like the difference between his fight with Cerrone Cerrone's fight with Iaquinta and Hooker's is, because I think Cerrone beat up on Iaquinta because he is designed to fuck up those kind of people, really, in his soul. He puts out too much offense. It's too dynamic. It's too dangerous, and people walking onto it just kind of, it's the whole like boar spear type thing. You just run into it and you just get fucked up. Mm-hmm. As long as you can't just get in there and stay there. But with Hooker, it's his ability to throw and not be settled that was really troubling. His ability to throw and not be like, not step in as he does it, which was really troubling Iaquinta, because like he could just like, and he's a great example of how you don't really need to throw very hard to hurt people in MMA. You really don't need to step down on your shots a lot.
That's one of the first things boxers learn that so many MMA fighters have yet to, is that you just need to put the punches out there. You don't have to put intentions on them, really. You just have to aim them and extend your hands. You know, especially if you're in Hooker's position, as this fight carried on, and your opponent is chasing you. You just have to let them run into your fist. He did a remarkable job with that with his jab. Yeah, I think I like.
Huh. Sorry, you go.
Well, I appreciate the Rothwell comparison now more. The whole like stalking with the square body, and you just can't help but being destroyed by body shots, and that's why he lost to Edson Barboza. Like I'm with that, but really, I think the strong point of that comparison is the extended guard that both Hooker and Ben Rothwell use, and the reason that they use it is that they are tall, long guys who are not fast. And if you want to use your reach, but don't want to have to give your opponent, the whole length of your punch extending, all of that time to read the punch and get away from it, you're not quick enough for your hands to cross that distance very quickly. Then you make up for that by fighting with a longer guard. You extend your hands before you've thrown the punch, and you willingly take power off your shots in the interest of landing them more consistently. So yeah, that's actually like an interesting observation. I think it's a big part of Hooker's style as he improves as a range fighter, is that he just kind of keeps his hands close to the target, and not many MMA fighters do that.
Yeah, and I think so I seeing that, it was when I watched the Gilbert Burns fight again, and I was like, oh, this is how he fights. And I think it's also like, it reflects how he shares some like fighting DNA with Adesanya, because it's a different kind of like handsy manipulative style, right? Mm-hmm. It's that your hands are there to like push and catch and move people out of the way to strike. The Foreman mummy guard and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Is that it's a different evolution of that style, but it's you can see there are distinct similarities there.
I think it's
he wasn't winding up on huge leg kicks either.
No,
it didn't matter, because every time that Iaquinta had weight on it, he would just punt out his calf.
It's more important to just have the shot be well placed than it is to put everything into it. And it's probably something coming out of their shared Muay Thai backgrounds. This is also something that you would see from Matt Brown a good bit, and Matt Brown was always really good at sort of, I went to a seminar once where Matt Brown was, and the idea was like extending the clinch. Like, where does the Thai clinch begin? And like their point was essentially, it's like from boxing range. The clinch can start there. You reach out and grab the dude's hand, or you touch his head with your palm. You're clinching now, getting that grip on your opponent. And yeah, Hooker does that very well. So does Adesanya. The sort of blurred boundary between what is boxing range and where is it safe to reach out and start manipulating your opponent's guard and their head position. But also I think, a lot of boxers do that too.
I also think Hooker did a really good job of hiding his right hand.
Mm-hmm. He always does.
Yeah, he really played off that mixture between the left hand and between the jab and the low kick for most of the fight. And Winter is someone who really likes countering right hands with right hands.
Mm-hmm.
And until he just went for left jab and low kick, until Iaquinta basically forgot about the right hand. And I was basically watching the fight thinking, he's really hiding his right hand for this. And both the times he hit him with the right hand, he hurt Iaquinta very badly.
Yep. Super
Did
clean.
exactly the same thing to Gilbert Burns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great performance from Hooker in a fight that was designed to let him have a great performance. Now let's run back that Barboza fight. We can start feeling bad about his chances again. But no, I really have... Dan Hooker is also, so many of the fighters that become my favorites, he's a fighter who has genuinely grown and evolved in a way that makes sense. He has thought about his style as a fighter, or he and his camp have at the very least, and he has developed, and I like that. The Dan Hooker that just beat Al Iaquinta was not the Dan Hooker who ran into Maximo Blanco's counters over and over in his second UFC fight. So, good shit. And yet more reasons to laud that camp that he and Adesanya both come out of. What a good night for them. Speaking of good nights for certain camps, tied to Ivasa. No, I think we're done, actually, with UFC 243. And let's move on to previewing Jedrzejczyk versus Waterson. You want to take the lead on this one, Phil?
Yeah, so I think the basic question for this one is, how bad is Michelle Waterson going to lose? And with that being said, do we both consistently underrate Michelle Waterson way too much? Because I know I do.
Yes. Yeah. I think the thing I underrate, as is often the case, is that she is a fantastically good athlete. I think because she's not like a ripped, muscular monster that you don't tend to think of it quite as often. But for example, Felice Herrig is a fighter who's kind of known for being strong and has a ripped physique. She sure as hell didn't look notably stronger than Michelle Waterson in their fight. In the clinches, Michelle Waterson was largely winning. And at range, her speed was a huge factor that she was able to intercept. She was able to intercept Felice Herrig's head with kicks as Herrig was still loading up on the punch she was trying to enter the pocket with. So that's the thing with Michelle Waterson. She's very fast. That has stood out to me in watching her recent performances. Her hand speed, her kicks, they're all incredibly quick. And I think the thing that's led you and I to, certainly me, to underrate her so often is that, her style is just kind of a mess. Beyond that, it's just sort of a disaster. It's very Anthony Pettis in its sort of formless reliance on just pure dynamism. And I don't think she has the power of Anthony Pettis, but she certainly does share his penchant for surprising people with her finishing ability. But what we've seen out of Michelle Waterson in her recent performances is almost the first broad stylistic shift she's taken in her whole career. And I think it has resulted in her becoming a much better fighter and much more of an actual contender in this division. The change is basically just paying attention to where you are in the cage and relying more heavily on movement. Waterson used to spend a lot of her earlier fights just sort of she'd get the distance she wanted, where she was all right, I'm just outside the kicking range. And then she would just wait for them to come forward, stand her ground and wait, and then try to kick them. And then, some kind of scramble, and maybe it would be a head and arm throw in there or whatever. Then the madness would ensue and we'd be in a scrambling kind of fight. But now, in these last three performances, granted, especially with Herrig, Casey, and Kovalkiewicz, in fact, all three of them, these are performances designed to emphasize any attempt to do an outfighting sort of style. But in all three of those, Michelle Waterson has shown that she is now committed to moving laterally and forcing the opponent to chase her, not just waiting for their leads, but drawing their leads out of them, making them adjust to her constantly with movement. It makes her athletic prowess a much bigger factor. So I think she's become like a much more consistent fighter as a result of that.
Yeah, I mean, she's a very, like, as we've typically said with Jackson Wink fighters, she does diversity does a lot of heavy lifting for her, but she's the parts of her game the parts of the game which Jackson Wink do well, she is very good at.
Yeah.
She is, she will not concede to firefights when she doesn't have to. She's a very willing and very, very quick kicker.
Mm-hmm.
That's the defensively. She's no great shakes, but like in comparison to someone like Anthony Pettis, I think she's better because there's no specific place that you want to fight her. Like, I think she's not like Pettis in that like she's a completely empty clinch fighter. She is both a willing and able clinch wrestler, and she's actually quite good with elbows and knees in the clinch.
Yeah, she is. That came through in the Herrick fight and the Kolokiewicz one, but her ability to frame her opponent off and find little spaces to then fill with very quick, short strikes is quite good.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about this fight is that it's going to be one where Jedrzejczyk is not going to be being pressured. It's going to be one of the ones where she has to come forward. And we haven't necessarily seen that all that much in her UFC career.
We saw it in her last fight.
Yeah, exactly.
Uh-huh.
Is that Jedrzejczyk really likes people to come on to her. That didn't sound right.
Cut that right now. Phil, I wasn't even thinking of it. I think you just indicted yourself as a creep. I didn't even think of it. I'm such a good, pure boy. You are a fucking sex freak. You're a pervert.
They all do, I tell you.
But you are correct. I would alter that somewhat.
I bet you would. Please do.
Yeah, not just in terms of phrasing, but I would say that the Jedrzejczyk who first came to the UFC was a lot more willing to come forward.
Yes.
She was much more aggressive. Like, I think her style has undergone several sort of stages. She's always maintained certain tendencies throughout that, but like, as a Muay Thai fighter, as a kickboxer, she was at her most aggressive. She was super willing to throw just naked kicks. She was also very much into like the Ernesto Hoost style Dutch combos. She would just charge forward, throwing 3 punches without any like real intent on which one was the good punch, all interested in setting up the low kick at the end. And always willing to crash into the clinch aggressively. Which, was a problem for her in her fights with Shevchenko in particular. Then she comes to MMA. She basically gets rid of the kicks for her first several years as an MMA fighter, becomes much more reliant on her boxing, body punching, jabs, everything working around setting up that big overhand right and the right uppercut that plays off of it, and putting herself in a position where she's not vulnerable to takedowns. And she becomes so confident with her wrestling that the kicks start to return. And then she goes to ATT, and she develops into the fighter we have today, which is a much more of an evasive back foot boxer and outfighter, plus the kicks are back as a consistent element. So that's the curious thing about this matchup, and I think why I said at the top of the show why it's potentially more dangerous for her than it ever has been before, or at least less likely to be won cleanly, because I don't know that she still possesses the ability to come after opponent and press for the clinch that aggressively. And if she doesn't, she's slower than Waterson. I think she's technically better in most regards. She's certainly like a better combination striker. She's more diversely skilled as a striker, but she's slower. And if she's not willing to force Waterson into the clinch, where Jedrzejczyk's strength and clinch fighting skills are going to be a big problem for her, then how does this fight really shake out? It might be kind of close, it might be very close.
I don't. So gonna counter this a bit and say that Michelle Waterson poses a lot of the same strengths and weaknesses as Tisha Torres, and is debatably like worse, seeing as Tisha Torres kind of beat her pretty cleanly.
Yeah.
She is quicker, but she is also very undersized.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is just a matchup of like a Jackson Wink fighter against a moderately functional kickboxer.
Yeah.
Which is a style matchup which I've managed to use to pick like a number of like weird upsets over the years based on this one simple heuristic.
Just pick like, the ATT striker over the Jackson Wink kickboxer, basically every time.
Yeah. How could you pick David Tamer over Lando Venata?
Yeah. That was a good one.
Yeah. So, and yeah, you got to ask yourself, how would Waterson actually win this fight? She's not going to win on volume. I can't see her winning a striking match. Like, what is she just going to like gallop around and kick?
Yeah,
Joanna Jedrzejczyk?
It would have to be a very good, precise shot, which there is a chance. It's not like Joanna's strength is her striking defense. And this is the thing I want to point out. That this like my main reason for concern. Joanna Jedrzejczyk's closest fights, or most difficult fights. Valentina Shevchenko, obviously, in a matchup where she was like more uncomfortable coming forward than ever before, but just kind of had to keep trying to do it. Now, Michelle Waterson does not pose the same kind of counter threat. She does not pose the same kind of clinch threat as Valentina Shevchenko. She's certainly not the same kind of physical monster that Shevchenko is. Just like, a disgusting, barely human kind of Hulk that is Valentina Shevchenko. But there's also the fight with Valerie Letourneau. And that was a fight that was largely contested at kicking range. And Valerie Letourneau, it may be forgotten now, she had a lot of success with her kicks in that fight. And Jacek was still able to, like, if those kicks aren't finishing her, she's a great counter kicker. She's very willing to play that kind of game. But, especially early, Letourneau had a lot of success in a range kicking battle with Joanna Jedrzejczyk. So I don't know. I think it's a close or very admirable performance is like one reasonably good game plan away for Michelle Waterson. And I don't know how invested Greg Jackson is these days in game planning for his fighters, but maybe he'll turn up for this one. I don't know.
Okay, so I will say two things. I think that Joanna has said how much she hates cutting to strawweight on multiple occasions, and has blamed it on her team and said that, and then said that her team is the best in the world, and said various crazy MMA things. But I think there's a reason why she cuts weight, and she really does like being the bigger person.
Absolutely,
she likes having a size and to be able to dictate the range. And I think that it is notable that like some of her worst performances have come against people with like size parity.
Letourneau was definitely a problem in that regard. The frame was a big part of what threw her off. And like in terms of Waterson, she's been having great performances lately. I do think we occasionally criticize like her boxing. I think her punching has come a long way. I agree. Yeah.
I wouldn't class her as a great boxer, but like she's just learned how to put weight into her shots and punch in combination.
It's still mostly single shots and stuff like that, but they're quick, they're well placed, and they look harder than they ever have before. Look like better punches.
But also, like the time when she fought someone who was just like big and physical was when she fought Courtney Casey, and I think that was kind of a robbery. I thought Casey kind of beat the shit out of her, and I'm gonna go out on a limb here. I'm going to say something that might shock you. I think Joanna Jedrzejczyk is better than Courtney Casey.
You dog! Take that back right now. Now, you know what? I suspect you may, in fact, be correct. I don't know if she's quite the same kind of physical monster that Courtney Casey is, but she's certainly a lot better. Footwork, technique, the ability to think and adapt mid-fight. These are all strengths of Joanna Jedrzejczyk that Courtney Casey doesn't necessarily have. And it is worth considering, too, that like some of Waterson's flaws, technical flaws, they have bit her even in range fights. Like Rose Namajunas beat her at range. It's not like Joanna Jedrzejczyk can't like tie him a good counter head kick. You know, we've seen those moves from her. So obviously I'm still picking Joanna. I just think she's the better fighter in a lot of ways. The main thing I want to emphasize is just like the source of my caution is that the Joanna Jedrzejczyk of today, I think, is less likely to dominate Michelle Waterson than she would have been a couple years ago. So that's what makes it interesting to me. Waterson has a chance here that I really wouldn't have given her before.
Yeah, I think, well, if nothing else, she has really earned this.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
She's earned a title eliminator, and I didn't think I'd be saying that.
Yeah, I agree. All right, well, that's the main event of next weekend's card. Let's take one more break, and when we come back, we're just going to kind of machine gun jump our way through the rest of the undercard and pick out what we find interesting. We will be talking about Chito Vera versus Andre Ewell. We'll be talking about Davis and Figueiredo versus Tim Elliott, maybe. Nico Price versus James Vick. I don't know. All of that, none of that, and more after this.
Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
All right, welcome back to Heavy Hands. Let's go ahead and rip through this undercard and preliminary card of this event, which we may choose to call UFC Tampa or UFC Jedrzejczyk versus Waterson, or as they've confusingly chosen to call it, Joanna versus Waterson. Which, like, just do both first names if you're going to avoid having to say Jedrzejczyk on the poster. I don't know. Okay, which one do we want to talk about first? Well, we were just talking about Chito Vera, so why not? Let's kick it off with the curtain jerker. Chito Vera, whose utter fearlessness and his willingness to take on anybody, anywhere. He's the greatest road warrior in the UFC right now. He's always just a road dog, constantly traveling, fighting people in their hometowns, so on and so forth. If you are willing to do that in the UFC, if you are willing to dig trenches for a living, by God, will Dana White hand you a shovel every single time you hold your hand out. And so Marlon Vera, his endearing willingness to do whatever it takes, has once again been slotted into a preliminary card opening fight against an opponent, Andre Ewell, that no one really knows, but who is, in fact, very dangerous. And that's the Chito Vera way. So, how do we see it shaking out?
Yeah, this is where 4 straight finishes gets you.
Yeah, right? This is what an incredible run and a winning personality and, you know, all the makings of a potential fan favorite. This is what you get. You're fighting Andre Ewell.
When no one is watching. So this seems like a fight where Chito Vera is going to get punched extremely hard in the face for the first round. And I don't know why I bothered even saying that, because it's a Chito Vera fight.
Yeah, but Ewell is particularly fond of punching people hard in the face.
So Ewell is a very one-note fighter, but it is a very good note in that he's extremely good at setting up a long and very untelegraphed left hand. That's pretty much it. Like, he really doesn't seem to have many ancillary skills at all.
Yeah, he's got a good jab and a right hook as well. I think he's, like, in general, as a someone with sort of pocket boxing skills who, because of his reach, his pocket is much longer than most of his opponents. That's his thing. Lands good shots from far away.
And he's had a weird mixture of performances in the UFC because he showed horrific takedown defense and then fought Renan Barão, who just kind of stared at him and got fucked up for the whole fight.
He fought the ghost of Renan Barão, who took him down and dominated him on the floor after getting hurt in the first round of their fight. And then Andre remembered to put on the magic amulet, which convinces the ghost of Henan Barao that it actually doesn't know how to wrestle, and then he won the rest of the fight. And then he fought Nathaniel Wood, who wrestled the fuck out of him. He took him down and beat his ass. And then he fought, who was it? Anderson Dos Santos.
Yeah.
Who is a guy.
Again, mostly beat the shit out of him, with the exception of like some baffling takedown situations.
Yeah. Ewell does not have good wrestling skills.
No. So the question is, like, obviously that Chito Vera isn't really much of a takedown threat or anything threat in any specific area. He's just good at random explosions of violence.
Yeah. He's good at, you know, feeding off of the punishment you hand out to him in the first round, essentially. That is his skill.
Yes. Is that enough? I'm going to say yes.
It's very thin analysis, Phil, I gotta tell you.
I don't care. That's how you analyze Chito Vera fights.
Yeah.
He's good in the clinch. He's got some sneaky trip takedowns. He can jab. He can low kick. He does a lot of things. Who knows when he's going to do them or why?
Yeah.
Whether it's merely going to be his, like, I'm getting hurt limit break, where he just explodes into a lion-hearted burst of like, finishing violence. But, like, Ewell genuinely doesn't seem like he's improving his grappling much at all. And Chito is actually a really good grappler.
He is. He's a really, really quick, tricky submission grappler. Aggressive on the ground, too.
Yeah, I mean, he's one of those classic guys where it was basically, he's developed as a finish-first fighter, and he started off as just being a head kicks and rear naked chokes guy.
Yeah.
And, I'm just going to pick that he's going to get fucked up, and then he's going to find something. And that's how Chito Vera wins fights, and I'm going to pick him to do it again.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I will say, just to add a little bit more of, like, I get it. Chito Vera's, like, maybe my number one favorite fighter right now. He's certainly up there. And his fights are not determined by specific skills, but by, you know, the contents of his character, by his heart, his will, you know, how successfully he pretends that the first round beating is in fact a good and productive therapy session that makes him the better person that can then go on to win rounds 2 and 3. But I will say that Chito Vera he seemed like he knows himself a little more as he's gained experience. Certainly, as you depressingly pointed out, Phil, he's got these 2 losses, and then he's on a 4-fight win streak, and that largely has to do with the fact that he's just fighting worse fighters. Like, he lost to Douglas De Silva and John Lineker, but then he beat Wooly Chi Buren and Guido Canetti and Frankie Saenz and Noel Hernandez. These are not bad fighters, with the possible exception of Buren, who, you know, even is not a terrible fighter, but they're definitely much worse. All of that aside, Chito has shown that he is much more willing to put his foot on the gas early. He starts more aggressively, and usually now very consistently by the beginning of the second round, he is coming out looking to kill. And he's always been a fighter who is like, the comeback is baked into his essence. But there were a lot more fights in the past where he wouldn't really turn it on till like the end of the third round. You know, like it would take a long time for him to wake up enough. A lot of Colin Oyama screaming at him in the corner and just like cussing in his face, demanding that he just walk forward and start throwing shit. And it finally has started to sink in, I think. So I think that may also be effective against Ewell. Like I think Ewell's boxing, he's a swing punches to scare you off kind of fighter. And when that hasn't succeeded, that has been when people have gotten in on the wrestling situations, but more importantly, it's when people have backed him into the fence and hit him with strikes as well. So, if Chito Vera does, over the course of the fight, develops a willingness to not get scared off, but press forward as Ewell attacks, the opportunity is there for him to win. Other than that, like, it's actually a very dangerous fight for Chito. one in which he'll be fortunate that he's such a durable, tough fighter because Ewell has power and is an accurate puncher, and it's very likely that Cheeto loses this one. Ewell's like a good athlete, a big hitter. He's got a big frame for the division. Once again, it's an unheralded but still very difficult fight for Cheeto, as they kind of all seem to be. But I just love the guy.
As you mentioned, like his competition lately hasn't been great, but it's notable that it has gotten harder. But the most encouraging thing is that his fights have actually gotten easier.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he did better against Frankie Saenz and Noel Hernandez than he did against Guido Canetti and Luigi Buren, who are undeniably worse fighters.
Yeah, Luigi Buren was maybe his worst start of these last 4 fights. Like, he lost the first round to Luigi Buren. So yeah, that's a good sign. It's a good sign. I think he may have sort of built some momentum, and he's more committed now to being the aggressive fighter that he should have been all along. So it should be good. There's no way that's not a fun fight to watch. What next? Shall we talk about the featured prelim? Nico Price versus James Vick?
This is mean.
Yeah. But you know what? James Vick has it coming. He's the Lloyd Irvin fighter that, unlike Sadiq Youssef, I don't have to like compromise my morals because he's so good. Like, he's just he's just weak enough in the right areas that I can be like, yeah, fuck you, you Lloyd Irvin bitch. So, it is mean. Like, if you were thinking of a matchup to test James Vick in his long overdue attempt to move up to the welterweight division, this is like, who did they give Luke Rockhold when he moved up? That surprisingly beat him? Blachowicz, of course. This is more like if they gave Rockhold, like, I don't know,
Thiago Santos?
Yeah, something like that. Or like, a shittier Anthony Johnson. If they gave Rockhold like a Jared Cannonier when he was still at light heavyweight. This is someone who's like not that great, but is 100% a puncher and knows it. That's Nico Price. And that is specifically the thing that James Vick has had trouble with, is not getting knocked out cold. So, is that what we're predicting to happen in this matchup?
You gotta predict it, right? Is that it's one of those ones where you can predict like how it's gonna happen.
Yeah.
Like, Vick is gonna just be carving Nico Price up. He's gonna be landing like jabs and like low kicks and push kicks, and he's just gonna be like, man, I'm faster than people at this weight class. And then Nico Price is just gonna instantly dead him at the end of the second round.
That sounds about right. Yeah, for Vick, it's, this is one of those cases where, I think he should have moved up a while ago and gotten sort of used to the welterweight division. This is certainly not an easy fight, especially when you've lost your last 3 in a row, for your first foray into the higher weight class. But his problem is not just that cutting to lightweight has almost certainly damaged his chin. It's not merely an issue of durability. It's also, as it is with Rockhold, a matter of technique and how his style has developed. And like, when it comes right down to it, James Vick is still too psychologically insulated by his reach to have ever gotten comfortable fighting when it's taken away from him. So like, the moment somebody gets inside of his range and is still swinging punches, he's just doing all the wrong things. His chin's high, he's backing up straight, he's reaching out and extending his hands rather than tightening up and defending himself. He just does all the wrong things technically when his range is taken away from him. So, like, I think you laid it out pretty perfectly. Nico Price is, like, just formless enough as a fighter that he's going to give James Vick that range unwittingly. He's going to eat a lot of kicks. He's probably going to be the first guy who actually eats a James Vick flying knee. And then eventually he's just going to decide, like, in Cheeto Vera-esque fashion, that he has to step into the pocket, and he's going to knock James Vick out. That sounds about right.
Yeah, I mean, Nico Price is not, like, good. There is a chance that Vick just keeps beating him for the rest of the fight. But yeah, I can't trust him to do that.
He might knock him out. I mean, Price has taken a lot of punishment in all of his fights.
Yeah, it took a hell of a lot from Jeff Neal to put him away.
Yeah, it did.
And, like, he's not unfinishable, but it took a lot from Jeff Neal. And he also, like, hurt Jeff Neal pretty badly, and Jeff Neal is a better striker than James Vick.
Yeah, remember when he spent the entire first round eating every single punch Tim Means threw at him, and he just like decided to knock Tim Means out, a vastly better striker? Yeah, that's Nico Price. Okay, well, let's pick one more, Phil. I say we are deciding between. I mean, I would love to say Eric Anders versus Gerald Meerschaert.
That fight's going to rule in all the wrong ways.
Yes, it's going to be perfectly hideous. I say we choose between the co-main event, Cub Swanson versus Kron Gracie, likely to be depressing if the career momentum continues, but then again, Swanson's fight with Shane Burgos was close and competitive, and maybe a much worse striker is the recipe for him to get back on the winning track. I think it's actually a fairly well-made fight. That or Davison Figueiredo versus Tim Elliott, a tantalizing contenders battle in the flyweight division.
Let's go Davison Figueiredo, because I think, the Kron Gracie Cub Swanson one I don't like just because it's too much of a referendum on whether Cub Swanson is shot.
Yeah, that's really what it hangs on. Okay, Figueiredo then. What have we learned about him recently? We saw him totally neutralized, more or less, by Jussier Formiga, but then we saw just how terrifying he is as a physical force against Alexandre Pantoja. In an instant classic of a fight. I fear people have already started to forget. If you forget that fight, go back and watch it right now. It's really, really good.
How just fucking ruled. It was just two guys who just refused to back down.
Yep.
And just a non-stop, incredibly violent bloodbath.
So how does that match up with Tim Elliott? Because Tim Elliott is one of the weirdest dudes in this division.
Yeah, he's one of the more... So the question is, the question here has got to be, how much do you trust Tim Elliott's offensive wrestling? Because it's actually really good.
It's surprisingly good. The thing I always think of is his fight with Joe Benavidez, in which he got guillotined in the first round, but not before taking Joe Benavidez down 5 or 6 times. Which, who else has done that? No one, right? Demetrius Johnson didn't get Joe Benavidez down that many times.
Yeah, I mean, he's one of the few people to have actually genuinely, this wasn't just due to wrestling. It's often thought, I think it's, people think of his the Pyrrhic round that he won against Demetrius Johnson as being just him out wrestling him, and it kind of was to an extent, but he also hurt Demetrius Johnson. It's one of the very few people who actually has.
Did he?
Yeah. There's actually he punched into a clinch exchange, and DJ is visibly rocked.
Yeah.
So he is
it's got to be the first opponent who has matched Davison Figueiredo's own levels of weirdness, right? Of bizarre timing and weird transitions from one phase to the next. So that's interesting.
Yeah, because on the one hand, sometimes he can look bizarrely offensively dangerous, and it can look like a really effective wrestler. And other times he just gets obliterated.
Yeah.
What happened in that Ben Nguyen fight?
I don't know. Being very, very hittable didn't help against one of the most genuinely hard-hitting men in the flyweight division. Probably had something to do with that.
And so that tends to be the answer, right?
Yeah,
Does it have to be the answer?
I mean, the thing is I'm not 100% sure how good. I suspect Davison Figueiredo can make up for a lot of his weaknesses with just sheer athletic ability. He's big and strong and quick and explosive. He's a fantastic scrambler. All of these things will come in handy if his aim is to prevent Tim Elliott from keeping him on the ground, because Tim Elliott is, as amazing as he is on the ground, he's going to keep the scramble going in a lot of situations, or he'll allow it to continue. But how good is Davison Figueiredo's layered takedown defense? That's the question. Jussier Formiga largely got him, I think, with just really well-timed takedowns. He got when his feet were planted and hit him as if timing a perfect counterpunch. It was all about the timing, if I recall correctly. And otherwise, he hasn't really dealt with a lot of like quality chain wrestling. And when it comes to takedowns, that's what Tim Elliott does. You know, it's not about the shot and the drive. It's about latching onto you and then running the pipe and then tripping out a leg or somehow lurching to your back as you're forced to go into like a referee's position to prevent him actually taking you down. It's weirdness in the wrestling department. So I don't really know. Like, I wouldn't be too shocked if Tim Elliott was just consistently able to get Figueiredo down, would you?
No, not at all. I mean, he has at points out-wrestled Joseph Benavidez and Demetrius Johnson.
Yeah.
Like, he's a really good, like, he is the cut rate Dominic Cruz, but, like, Dominic Cruz is an incredible MMA wrestler, and Tim Elliott is merely a very good one.
Yeah.
I mean, Mark De La Rosa he's a decent flyweight, and Tim Elliott made him look like he didn't belong in there at all.
Yep. So.
But yeah, I can't really go against the fact that I just don't trust Tim Elliott to finish Davison Figueiredo or to really be able to keep him down.
Yeah.
If, I think the performance that Jussier Formiga had to put out was one of his most masterful technical performances.
I agree. It's like a perfectly
seen from him in a long and very impressive career.
Yeah.
It was, one of those rare moments where someone does everything absolutely perfectly for the opponent in front of them.
Yeah.
And I'm just not sure that I can trust Tim Elliott to be able to replicate that kind of game plan. It's the things that make him threatening against technicians and that make him threatening against good fighters also make him, the sheer weirdness and unconventional nature of how he fought also make him vulnerable to worse ones, like Ben Nguyen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
100%.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think he might be walking into some huge meme KO at some point.
That sounds about right. Yeah. Boy, Tim Elliott, the man is made for being uppercutted. So. And flying kneed. So, yeah, there's a strong chance we'll see something like that from Figueiredo. I think I agree. And I think I'm going to agree with your pick. And I think that's the end of the episode. Thank you all, listeners, so much for tuning in. I feel good about this one, Phil. A lot of good fights to discuss.
Yeah, it was a lot of interesting fights last week. And I think, next week's card is, again, it's just really solid.
I think the secret to having a really good episode of the show is A, have a fascinating striking battle the weekend before. B, before anything has even been recorded, have an hour-and-a-half long shouting match about how Rogue One is or isn't a good movie. So
I never claimed Rogue One was a good movie.
No, he claimed it was his favorite movie. Don't let him lie to you. He loves Rogue One. The guy is absolutely nuts for whatever the name of the lead actress in that movie was. That's the end of the show. Thank you all for listening. Phil, before we wrap up, what do you got coming out this week?
Just the preview again. So we're going to be breaking down Jedrzejczyk Waterson. I don't think we're going to be taking on the depressing task of breaking down Gracie versus Swanson, and I'm glad.
Yep, good for you. Well, count on me this week to actually have an article coming out. I'm going to have a Whittaker Adesanya article. It's already in the works and partially completed, so hopefully before even this episode has come out, that will have shown up on bloodyelbow.com, where you can also find Phil's previews with David Castillo. Likewise, there will be a short video coming out from me on the MMANation.com YouTube channel about the main event, Joanna Jedrzejczyk versus Michelle Waterson. Not really like full-on analysis. It's just like a 3.5 minute sort of encapsulation of the narrative. But if you like that kind of thing, go over there and check that out. And support us on the Patreon. There is a boxing commentary up on there for Spence Porter. I think I may also try to do one relatively shortly about a commentary video of the Gennady Golovkin Derev Yanchenko fight from last weekend, which was kind of on a par with Spence Porter. It was a fantastic fight in which an aging Triple G gave a fighter like Derev Yanchenko the chance to really show off his excellent body punching and footwork on the inside, and He had to fight through a cut he got in like the second round, which was just an awful cut. And boy, it was a fantastic fight. So keep your eyes peeled for that. That's on the Heavy Hands Patreon, where $3 a month can get you access to all of our bonus episodes and lots more. And that's it. Thank you all again for listening. Oh, find us on Twitter, of course. Phil is at Evil Greg Jackson. Myself, you can find at Boxing Bush, B-U-S-C-H. And that is it. Thank you again for listening. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.